It is great, I have to say that, it is great to be back in Houston with all of you. Travel is wonderful, but there is nothing like being back home. Back in your home with all your stuff and no longer living out of a suitcase, especially after 3 months of it. And it's also a joy to be back here. Be back here in this meeting house, which is so full of love. I love walking into this space and just feeling that love and joy radiating from all of you. It gives me such energy, so thank you. Now, I was in India. It was bad timing on my part, but I was in India for the start of the monsoon season. And as I came back here, I realized I brought some of the monsoons with me this past week. So for all of those who are worried about drought, you're welcome. Now, there'll be more time for me to talk about my sabbatical. You'll hear enough about it in sermons, and I'm sure you'll be bored of it by the fall. And this upcoming Wednesday, I'll give a slideshow on it. But I'd like to say, before anything else, a big thank you. A thank you for the opportunity to actually go on that sabbatical and take that much-needed time. It was an incredible experience. I'd also like to thank, obviously, the Reverend Lynette Ross for her amazing ministry, her overflowing, compassionate heart, her wisdom, her guidance over the past 3 months with you. Again, she has been such a wonderful friend and guide to me personally, and I know how much she loves all of you and loves this place. I'd also like to lift up and celebrate all the great things that went on this summer that I got a chance to hear about. From Vacation Bible School to summer suppers, it has really been wonderful to see how engaged you've all been over the summer. And we have lots of good things planned for the fall. I hope to see you present at all of them. As I step back into the pulpit this morning, the lectionary gives us what I have to say is a remarkable scene. It's the Sabbath. Jesus is on his long journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And somehow, he gets invited to dine at the house of a leader of the Pharisees. You heard that correctly. Jesus is sharing a meal with those who are his chief antagonists. And I'm trying to imagine what prompted a leader of the Pharisees to invite Jesus over to a Sabbath meal. Was he intrigued by Jesus' teachings and wanted to see what he was like in person? Did he, like Nicodemus in the Gospel of John, secretly harbor interest in following Jesus? Or was he trying to see if he could trap Jesus into saying something the Pharisees could then use against him? Either way, here is Jesus, reclining, as was the custom, on a dining couch, enjoying the hospitality of a Pharisee. And during the first part of the meal, the part that gets cut out from verses 1 to 7, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath. Jesus wastes no time in challenging the religious assumptions of his host. Jesus is reinterpreting what following the law means for those around him. And then we have our lines in our passage for today. Everyone is gathered around the table. The miraculous healing of the man with dropsy is finished. The next course of the meal has just been laid. And Jesus surveys those seated around the room. According to custom, people are seated by their status in society. The best people next to the host, the lower status people seated farther away. When you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, Jesus begins, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give your place to this person. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, come up closer. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. Zinger. I do love Jesus. He does not mince words. That man has gumption. I mean, after healing on the Sabbath, he calls out in front of his hosts, no less, how people are seated around the table right there in that room. Suddenly, you can feel people looking around and thinking to themselves, am I seated in the right place? Be prepared for fireworks if you ever invite Jesus to a meal. And you can't help but love the premise of Jesus' admonition. You should strive to be humble, but also awesome. You want to be that person who has the quiet respect and admiration of those around you, the person everyone honors and wants to call friend, but do it without letting it get to your head. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. A classic Jesus statement on how God's view of status is the opposite of the world's. But it's the second part of this passage that intrigues me more. The first part is great and a good lesson. But it's the second part that has, I think, a true challenge for us today. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Here Jesus instructs us to show radical hospitality. Hospitality to those who cannot show the same to you. Hospitality that opens wide the door and demonstrates the richness of God's grace. As has been said many times, hospitality in the ancient world had an imperative that hospitality lacks today. In the ancient world, particularly in rural areas, hospitality was a bedrock virtue. We see it in the book of Genesis when Abraham shows hospitality to 3 angels. The great sin of Sodom, contrary to what some might say, was the violation of the rules of hospitality. If you were crossing a desert, hospitality could very much mean the difference between life or death. But by the time of Jesus, this ancient imperative to show hospitality had clearly waned. It took the shape of hospitality as it does today. We invite our friends, neighbors, and relatives over for meals, people we know. We don't invite random strangers, and certainly not those who aren't like us. So are we really supposed to do as Jesus commands in Luke 14? Should we go down the street and ask the homeless man to join us for dinner in our home? It's one thing to help that person, but to invite that person into our homes, is that realistic or advisable? We live in a major city. We need our private spaces. But here Jesus instructs us to do more than simply to give charitably or to volunteer our time. He wants us to welcome strangers as our social equals, people that we have nothing in common with. That's not an easy thing. How are we supposed to do this? I'll return to that question in a little bit. But first, I want to turn the tables, so to speak. I want to think about those times when we have been hosted rather than served as the hosts. Those times when you felt welcomed by those who didn't expect anything in return. As you all know, I recently returned from my sabbatical. One of the highlights of the sabbatical was a 4-week journey through the holy sites of northern India. In making my plans, I intentionally traveled alone. I wanted to be able to experience India and its people fully. I also traveled with only the barest of itineraries. I had a rough idea of the places I wanted to visit, but left the specifics open to the movement of the Spirit. While this might sound adventurous, and it certainly was, it also led to times when I was profoundly lonely. Loneliness is not a bad thing. We often learn the most about ourselves from times when we are alone. But it's not easy. And being alone and feeling alienated in a place like India can be particularly hard. The scorching heat didn't help. It's because I had those times of loneliness that the hospitality that was shown to me mattered so very much. At one point, I took an epic car trek from high in the Himalayas to a resort town in the foothills called Manali. The traffic, by the way, getting into Manali was horrific. It makes anything you might experience on the West Loop seem tame by comparison. It took us over 2 hours to go the last 4 miles into the city. At the time, I did not have an Indian SIM card, and my phone didn't get any service. So at 10:30 at night, after nearly 16 hours in a very cramped van, I was dropped off in the middle of a strange town. I was all turned around and couldn't figure out how to get to my hotel. Then someone who shared the van with me, someone I had not spoken with for the entire day, he sat several rows back in this cramped van, volunteered to walk me to my hotel. He had a cell phone that worked and had been to Manali before and wanted to make sure I was okay. He had no reason to do that. He didn't need to play host to me. I couldn't repay him in any way. But he showed me compassion, and that moved me deeply. Now, when I got to my hotel, I discovered that they were fully booked and they'd given away my hotel room. But that's another story for another time. The next day, I traveled to Dharamshala, another town in the Himalayan foothills. Dharamshala is best known as the home of the Dalai Lama. It was quite an experience to visit McLeod Ganj, which is the section of Dharamshala where the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan monks live. But what made visiting Dharamshala so rich an experience was the warm hospitality I received from a man named Alok. Alok is a friend of a friend. He had no reason to welcome me so warmly, and I'm not likely to ever be able to return the favor to him. And yet he carved out hour after hour of his busy schedule to be my host. We talked about everything Indian under the sun, everything. The poor man got to discover that I like to talk. And I'm surprised he didn't interrupt me at some point and ask, do you ever stop asking questions? Or have you ever considered speaking more slowly? To be there in a foreign land and to receive such hospitality was truly an example of God's grace. And I could name a half dozen other examples where I felt this kind of hospitality in India. Strangers on the streets of Delhi. A man who was in Rishikesh for an extended yoga retreat. My tour guide in Varanasi. Those moments sustained me, and they meant so much. And I'm sure there have been times when you have felt alone, when you felt alienated, lost, and someone showed hospitality to you. Hospitality that you could never give in return. You remember what that felt like? Because here's the question. What does lead someone to welcome people as Jesus would have us welcome them? How do we become more hospitable? How do we understand the roots of radical welcome? It comes from our own experience of exclusion or alienation. When I was a kid, I was a massive dork. I know that's hard to believe. I loved studying random things in my free time. I had a particular love of history. Then, when I learned all this new information about history, I couldn't wait to share it with others. Now, it turns out that kids in 4th grade don't love hearing about the battles of the American Civil War during recess. This came as a shock to me. I used to play a game in elementary school where I would take someone's name and then make as many historical connections with that name as I could. I thought it was a fun game to play. The other kids thought it significantly less fun. I had a hard time relating to kids my age. I was consistently one on the outside looking in. I was not one of the cool kids. The other uncool kids, my fellow uncool kids, tried to raise their coolness quotient by following around the cool kids. But my pride in elementary school prevented me from doing that. The result was that I often felt alone, excluded, and misunderstood. This feeling of alienation didn't abate when I started to attend a private school in 7th grade. In 7th grade, 8th grade, and 9th grade, I would regularly call up students in my class to hang out. Every weekend, I got on the phone and called up the other kids in my carpool group. And every weekend, they came up with some excuse or another why they were busy and could not hang out. I'll never forget in the spring of my 10th grade year, after lacrosse practice, when Matt Grabler, one of my classmates, invited me to hang out with his friends that weekend. It was the first time in 4 years that anyone had invited me to do anything social. 4 years. It's precisely these early experiences of loneliness and alienation that have led me to want to include people whenever I can. I know what it's like to be excluded. I know what it's like to feel as though you're not cool enough, not fashionable enough. And I know how important hospitality can be, what it can mean to hear those words, What are you doing on Friday? Do you want to join us to go see a movie? When I lived in Ames, Iowa, one thing I noticed was that there was no community for gay men. There were no gay bars in town, even though it was home to a 30,000-person research university. Given the nature of online dating, people found one another using apps on their phones. But those connections were often brief, and no sense of community emerged. The university had their LGBT center, but many students didn't feel as though that was their community. At the time, I was living with a tenured professor at Iowa State. He had a beautiful mid-century modern home, and I rented out his basement apartment. At one point, Matthew and I decided to open up our home to a dinner where any gay person was welcome, truly anyone. We wanted to create hospitality that we knew was needed in that community. And what started as a small dinner party for 8 morphed over time to dinners for more than 50 people. Matthew, who's an expert chef, would whip up a buffet dinner for whoever was hungry. Literally, he would make dinner for 50 plus. I tended the bar and usually dreamed up a cocktail for the night. Those monthly gatherings were remarkable. There were those there from ages 19 to 65, undergrads, graduate students, university administrators, professors, those who worked as lawyers or other jobs in town. One couple would drive over an hour to attend each of these gatherings. And the people fluctuated from one dinner to the next, but it was a place where people could find community, true community. And I saw it happen time and again. Friendships developed. People actually found their future spouses at some of those gatherings. The conversations ranged over politics, art, culture, university issues. I can't tell you how many people thanked us for putting on those gatherings. They weren't cheap to host. It took a lot of time to prep and clean up. But every time when someone expressed what it meant to feel welcomed, at a time when they felt alienated from the world around them, every time that happened, we knew that the effort was worth it. To this day, I love hosting people in our home. One of the many things that I love about Jess is that she's an amazing hostess who only occasionally gets mad at me for having an impromptu dinner gathering. Whenever we have people over, we try to broaden our circle. If someone asks if they can bring a friend, my answer is always yes. We will find a way somehow to make it work. What I've found over time is that when you're able to create space for others, particularly those whom you might not know or know very well, amazing things can happen. Over dinner, you can have deep conversations and learn all sorts of new things about a person. You become transformed by getting to know those who are different from you. You expand your horizon of experience, and you nurture sympathy for causes and interests that you never knew existed. Radical hospitality can be such a gift. And I'm sure you've experienced new perspectives from getting to know a stranger at some point. Maybe that's something that happened here at church. When I traveled to India, I learned a lot by broadening my experience of the world and of others. I was blessed to have that opportunity. But what if we sought to broaden our experiences of others here in Houston? This is a pretty diverse place. What would it mean and what would it look like? We don't have to travel across the globe to grow in sympathy for others. Jesus' call to radical hospitality, his imperative for radical hospitality, extends here to church. This is where we can be host. We can be host to whomever might feel alienated, lost, or alone in our culture and our community. We all know that there are many people out there that feel this way. Texas is not easy. Last year, when we did our strategic planning, we identified our calling to be a spiritual oasis. The first element of that is welcome. So how are we doing? How can we welcome others to this space? How can we make others feel welcome when they enter this space? How can we exhibit God's grace as new people enter? Or when we meet someone here whom we don't already know? These are crucial questions for us to ask. And the first thing we have to do is see the importance of welcome and also be honest about its challenge. We need to listen to Jesus' command in this passage because it helps us overcome our reluctance to greet a stranger or invite a new person. This is not Jesus suggesting that we welcome those who have been marginalized. Jesus frames it as something that we must do in response to him. the next thing we have to do is to discover within ourselves those times, those moments when we have felt excluded or alienated. We have to remember the experience of grace that comes with authentic welcome. This transformation within us fosters true compassion for those who need a space around the table. Look around this meeting house. Who do you see who might be visiting? Who do you see whom you don't yet know? Here are opportunities. Here is an opportunity for you to put your faith into action. You have the chance every Sunday to be a host here in this meeting house. You can be a vehicle of grace. Who knows what you'll learn, how you'll be transformed by initiating a new relationship. It could come as an invite to coffee, tea, and conversation, or to join a small group. It could take the form of inviting someone to lunch after church. This is a place where your faith can show itself. And when you develop that eye, that compassion for the stranger here, it begins to build the same instinct in other parts of your life. The welcoming of others, the welcoming of new people into our lives is not always easy. The easy thing is to say hi to those whom you know, to invite friends over to lunch in your home. To be truly hospitable in our world requires a bit of vulnerability. You have to open yourself up to someone new. That requires patience, the patience to listen to someone's story, the patience to try to understand someone who might be very different from you. But the power that lies within that simple extension of yourself is the power of grace. You have the chance to be that graceful welcome to someone else. It's the same welcome that so enriched my time when I was in India. It's the same welcome that Matt Grabler showed to me in 10th grade. It's the welcome that Matthew and I tried to show in Iowa. And it's the welcome that Jesus showed to others. That welcome is the beginning of the building of the kingdom of God. As Auntie Mame says in the great 1950s movie of the same name, life is a banquet, and most poor suckers are starving. Let us see ourselves as host at that same banquet of life. And in so doing, may we live into the great banquet that God hosts for all of us, and even for you.